In part 1, Professor Jerry Ravetz said that he's more than just a professor. Now, we got to hear from his other half, Mrs. Judy Ravetz. How did you two first meet?
Well, it's a very interesting story about how we ended up together in this small house in central Oxford, having come from different continents. Well, actually, I was an undergraduate at Leeds University. I was reading history, and it was the last day of term, and I was standing at the bus stop with my friend, and as one does, I looked on the other side of the road, and on the other side of the road was this tall, lanky guy. And Leeds at that time was a small university, and you'd usually seen faces around, and I hadn't seen this particular face, and I quite innocently said to my friend, "Who's that guy?" And she looked at me and she said, "Forget it. He's married, he's Jerry Ravetz, and he's an American." So I did for 20 years, 30 years I think, I forgot that. And then, unfortunately, my first husband died very suddenly, and I was widowed at 47. And then all of my friends try to get together to get me, had a passion for symmetry, and decided that they wanted to get me. So I had so many introductions to people, and I was really getting quite fed up. And then a friend from Sheffield met Jerry, knew Jerry, and thought he was interesting, and that she thought, I'll invite him and his wife to dinner. And so she asked somebody and said, "Who's his wife?" And the person said, "Oh, he's single." So she said, "Right, I'm going to have him for Judy." And that's what she did. And they arranged a meeting. I was in London, and Jerry was in Leeds, I think, at the time, and came down to meet me. And when he came at the door, I thought, it's familiar. I don't know, this guy's familiar, but I don't quite know where. And as soon as he came into the kitchen, behind an enormous bunch of flowers, came into the kitchen, I suddenly realised who he was. And he was the guy from the bus stop on the other side of the road. And my friend had told me to forget all about him. And there he was. So that was that was really quite extraordinary.
What went through your mind when your friend said, "I'm going to introduce you to a philosopher"?
Well, I thought, God, I know nothing about this. Absolutely nothing whatever about this. And I thought, if he wants to talk philosophy, he's got to find one of his own academic friends, because that's it. And the worst thing was, I knew that I'd been told that he'd done a PhD at Cambridge in mathematics. And my bête noire was mathematics. I did not understand number. I never had understood number. When I was a child, I used to say to my mother, if Z is the end of the alphabet, what is the end of the counting? And my mother, of course, could not explain that to me. Maybe she did, but I didn't understand. And I could not understand I didn't understand that the numbers were a language, and that you expressed yourself in number. So that has gone with me my whole life. And my great thing was, when am I going to tell him this? I told him that, and he didn't fall about. He simply said, "I'll teach you." And then I thought, this is the first way to end a relationship, if he starts to teach me maths, because I'm impossible. I lost so many boyfriends as they tried to teach me to drive, and I thought, this is just going nowhere. But anyway, he was very calm about it, and he said, "Well, look, we'll see about it, you know." And then he said, "You can pay me if you like." If that makes you feel better. And I thought, that was a joke, obviously. So I was warm towards him in many ways. For a start, it wasn't a black mark that I couldn't discuss maths with him. And then I realised, of course, that with a person, their work is one aspect of themselves, but the person is the other aspect. And what you marry is not the scholar. If you happen to be a scholar and you've got something in common, that's fine. But you have to have other things in common. Simpatico, you have to have an understanding. I think in understanding somebody else's family background is also quite important as well. And so those sorts of ways, the philosophy and the mathematics didn't matter, because I simply solved the problem by not discussing them. And that seemed to me to be, I discussed other things.
What was your job before you married Professor? And what was your passion?
Well, I started off teaching history, which I loved. And because I've got a lot of words, I always had stories to tell, and that went very well indeed. Passion was, my first husband was very, very musical, and he had great scores, and he was a terrific pianist, as were his family. And so I was brought with him. I learned a great deal about the whole sort of classical cadre and there'd be people coming to the house and singing Lieder and stuff, and it was all very, very classic music. And that, for me, from my background, my Jewish background of people who are not really educated, was a wonderful step into another way of life. So I would say that was one of my passions, music. And the other thing was, I was a wartime child. I was born in 1937 on the outbreak, well, just 2 years before the war broke out, and we were always moving around, so people didn't have gardens. You were always running away. If you have a garden, it means you're settled. You've got a settling, you're growing something. And we were always running around, and I always wanted a garden. And only when I got to be really quite middle-aged was I actually able to indulge my interest and passion for gardening, because gardening is really design, it's visual, and it's very, very sensual, and you can go into the garden and lose yourself. I've actually got a very small garden now in Oxford, but it's heavily planted and it gives enormous pleasure. And the great thing was, one of my granddaughters came and said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to have a garden just like yours." So that was really very nice. And so my history teaching was always at the background, always interesting. And going back to that, I think in careers you have to grow your career and develop it as you go along. And as I went through the history, the thing, I got to be fairly senior. I then ran the sixth form. And if you run a sixth form in a school, you need to know a lot about careers, university entrance, all sorts of things to talk to your students and also to their parents about. And the head teacher came to me one day and she said, "One of the parents says that I should start a careers department in the school." And she said, "Would you like to do it?" And she actually gave me time off to go out and learn how to do psychometric testing. Jerry did actually the maths part of it for me. Nobody knew that. We cheated. He did that. And I learned how to do that. And so that I basically, I developed a careers department. And then I was actually asked to go and work for the Independent Schools Careers department, and I did that. And then I went to Regent's College, and there I was dealing with undergraduates and graduates. And it's not, when you do careers work, it's not that people can't look up courses for themselves. The question is, you ask yourself, is not what shall I do, but what shall I be, who am I? I've got skills in all sorts of areas. And where shall I move? And that's where the discussion and the counselling come in. And that's really what I enjoyed.
Did Professor give you any input or show interest in your career?
Of course. He was always very interested in what I was doing, interested in the history, very interested in the history. Certainly wanted to know all about the clients, although of course that's confidential, so you never mention a name. I think Jerry was interested in it because it was very different from his abstract sort of work, his abstract ideas. And I was actually dealing with people, and people who are at a crucial stage in their lives when they have to think about things, you know, when things are not going that smoothly. Because if you're a student and you've got A's in all your subjects and you've done very well and you've done that, there's been no barrier at all, and suddenly you come to this thing, what shall I do to earn a living? And that is a problem that affected a lot of people. So it's not that you can't look up a course, that's nonsense. It's who am I and what am I looking for? And that was to me the essentially interesting thing about doing this careers, not necessarily advice, but careers counselling.
Well, I would say one reason I enjoyed helping Judy with her work was her marvelous gift for understanding people and getting people to open up. And I don't have that. I mean, I like people and all that, but I know my limits. So there's a wonderful complementarity between us. So the mathematics thing doesn't matter at all. You know, sort of people are good at different things, and who cares? Who cares?
I wish I had that kind of romantic stories to tell. In the meantime, I'll stick to something that I know a little bit more about, and that's science. What's this big book about?
Okay, I worked very hard on an introductory sentence, so I'll read that. The activity of modern natural science has transformed our knowledge and control of the world about us, but in the process it has also transformed itself and it has created problems which natural science alone cannot solve. So that was to see how did this happen and what can we do about it. So I spent, some hundreds of pages satisfying myself on what was going on. What triggered this is I couldn't stop to think about an audience because I was working stuff out for myself. And the book was quite successful in its way. It never quite fitted into anybody's teaching program because it wasn't philosophy, it wasn't sociology, but it certainly influenced people in its time.
When you wrote this book, what was the stage in your career?
Right. Okay. What had happened was, so I'd done my PhD in mathematics. I had a job teaching mathematics in Durham. Things were going okay, but I remembered that I knew all along my heart was not in mathematics, and I wanted to do something more general and philosophical. So I made contacts and had the great good fortune of getting to Leeds, where there was a brilliant young professor, Stephen Toulmin, setting up history and philosophy of science. That's what I began to do, partly doing history of mathematics, partly teaching the subject, and partly writing my big book. So that took me through the 60s. Then in the 70s, I sort of branched out into more direct connections with society. I was the secretary of a pioneering think tank called the Council for Science and Society. I then served on the Genetic Manipulation Advisory Group, which was another pioneering venture in the social regulation of science. And all the time moving on from what I'd actually done in the book. By the end of the 70s, I was sort of more experienced on the social side and still working on mathematical problems, or the problems of the use and abuse of mathematics. Then the next big thing that happened in my life was when I met my colleague Silvio Fontevich, an Argentinian who came to England actually as a spouse. His wife was on a postdoc. We met and we began working on our criticism of the use of mathematics in policy decisions. And out of that, we wrote a book and also got the idea of a convenient and powerful way of describing the new situation of science. And that was what we called post-normal science. So that was, by that time, was late 80s. Our fundamental paper was finally published in 93. And for that, we had two things. We had a diagram and a mantra. And here's the diagram, rainbow quadrant. And down here, where it's safe, you have what we called normal applied science. And that's where the problems are defined, the values are sorted out, and people can go ahead and do their research. Then we have an intermediate phase we call professional consultancy, and that is where people are science-based, but they're dealing with problems which are not straightforward out of the textbook. Like
Such as?
An engineer, a surgeon, so where the uncertainties are significant and also the stakes are high. I mean, the surgeon might kill somebody if things don't go according to plan. And you then have a different sort of society. You have professional associations, Whereas in the sciences, you have subject specialty communities. Okay. But then this was intermediate, and I would say nowadays we will have things like mad cow disease, as an example, the hazards of nuclear power, where the uncertainties are very great and the stakes are very, very high, and where simply you don't get the answers out of a textbook, or you don't even get them out of a professional practice. So this is when society comes in, because the facts and the values are entangled, and where you need democratic processes. Now, we then had, to describe the situation of the post-normal science, we had a mantra: facts uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, decisions urgent. And this is quite challenging, because in our culture, people generally still want to believe that the scientists produce the facts. And if you have a social problem, climate change, COVID-19, well, we go to the scientists and say, what are the facts? And the scientists will give answers which look like facts, as much as the boiling point of water, but in fact, the uncertainties are very, very great, and people with different perspectives have a legitimate role. We call that the extended peer community.
And so how do you feel about now people being able to go on the internet and find a lot of different ideas, opinions? Yeah. Would they be part of the conversation?
Well, that is the big question of the age, because people can go on the internet and find misinformation in all sorts of ways and get very confused. And very bad things can happen because of everybody jumping on board and joining the argument. But when I look at that process and know how badly it can go wrong, I'm reminded of what Winston Churchill said about democracy. And that is, it's the worst possible system except for all the others. And so post-normal science is actually, it starts off philosophically, well, what sort of knowledge is this? What about the uncertainties? And it then becomes a political program of extending democracy into science. Not necessarily scientific research, because, there's a lot still to be done down here, and you need your specialists and your experts. But when it comes to the application of science to public policy, then what we now realize is that if you don't involve the people, you can get things very, very wrong.
When you look back at the times when you first wrote the book and throughout the ages, I'm sure there are lots of I told you so moments. It seems like history's repeated itself.
Yeah.
But were there phenomena where you think, I got it totally wrong? And the second question is, have you changed your mind on certain things?
I have made some big mistakes in my career. I have the feeling, well, actually, when I got to the end of writing this, and it was my spare time over the best part of 10 years, and I had to say, well, what are we going to do? So I then wrote a very speculative last chapter, which had all sorts of crazy stuff in it. It was really radical romantic 60s counterculture stuff. And even as I wrote it, I thought, well, this is not a blueprint. And certainly things have turned out very differently. But on that, I have the feeling we caught something that was just being born then, and that is modern science. and I think on the fundamentals, it's still okay. As science continues to develop, it may well become obsolete. But
Why is that?
Well, because the world will be different, and I can't predict how different the world will be. But I could say that the conception of science that we've inherited from the 17th century, from people like Galileo and Descartes, that is now in many ways obsolete. So this will be obsolete,
How do you feel as a pioneer?
Well, that's life. And also, the one thing I wouldn't want to happen is that as these ideas become popular, they become taken up and used for purposes of which I disapprove. So I couldn't describe it in detail, but I could imagine how people would use post-normal science in order to confuse the situation and to say, well, there's no truth in there anyway, anything goes. What we have had and may continue to have is that people who are actually doing work that is driven by policy, believing it's just science. And we have a great example of this in quite recent times, eugenics, where there were people who quite sincerely believed that there were superior races and inferior races. The superior races were threatened by all those inferiors breeding too many children, and they developed science and policies to protect civilization from these inferior non-white people. And it's embarrassing that some of the most distinguished scientists, including founders of modern statistics, really believe this. And so if you said to them, well, the whole problem of genetics is post-normal, they would say, oh no, I'm just doing science. See? So in that sense, post-normal science is an awareness of what is actually happening, brings things out into the open, where people would sincerely believe, it's just the facts. And so in that way, the idea is radical, but of course can be abused.
You are the Associate Fellow of Oxford's Institute for Science, Innovation and Society. My question is not just the relationship between science and society, but scientists and society. Because as we can see from the COVID pandemic, there seems to be two camps of people who think A, scientists should present the data and offer solutions, and B, that they should just tell us the facts but stop at giving advice on public policy. What do you think?
Well, that's all part of the problem. And so then you might say, is the COVID epidemic a post-normal science problem? Is climate change or climate emergency a post-normal science problem? And there will be a very great temptation by people in all sorts of positions of responsibility to say, oh no, it's just normal science and here are the facts. We will tell you what the facts tell you what to do. On the other hand, you can say, wait a minute, there are very great uncertainties there are very great complexities. And so for instance, any policy that you adopt, like a lockdown, has huge social effects, psychological effects. Now, you can't give a number for those, but you can say they are serious. And so if you recommend a lockdown, you then say, okay, we know we're going to have economic, personal, psychological effects. and balance and somehow bring that into the discussion. The other way would simply be to say, well, we know the way epidemics happen. If you keep people out of contact with each other, they will not spread the disease so much. Therefore, we have a lockdown. Now, a lockdown may very well be the correct policy, taking everything into account. There is a real debate. And if you deny the debate, if you say it's just normal science, we have the facts, you do not carry the people with you. You cannot successfully implement the problem. So I would say post-normal science is helping people to recognize what is real in these major policy debates. It doesn't entail any solution at all. It simply means that we are now in a situation, I think thanks largely to the internet, where it is no longer effective to say the facts determine the policies. Also, there is the thing which hasn't been mentioned yet. We're assuming that people with a PhD and a job in science are themselves competent to produce facts and assess facts. And this is not always the case. And in fact, for nearly 10 years now, the community of science the communities of scientists have been concerned with the problem of quality. And I smelled that problem coming when I wrote this book, because of my own experience of science in universities. And so you can then find people arguing about people who are not PhD trained, but who with experience arguing, let's say, about the quality of the statistics or the quality of the models, and doing so quite reasonably. One sees this more clearly, I think, especially in the States, where there's a lot more litigation on these things. Did you ever know the film Erin Brockovich? Mm-hmm. Okay, and she taught herself enough chemistry to realize that the company was faking the data.
What would be your advice to scientists now who have the internal and external pressure to do quality research, collaborate with funding partners without compromising their integrity, and be respected by the public? That's tall order.
Actually, I have a friend who does modeling, partly, and he has just these problems because he sees how uncertain so much of it is. And you find if you start talking about this, your friends, your colleagues sort of look at you, And I suppose all I can say is there was a time before the war when leading scientists really thought that doing science you get away from all the messes and insoluble problems of society. And there's even a quote from Einstein about this. And you say, sorry, it ain't me, babe, anymore. That science is in society, like it or not. And best to grow up. And that's why I say, if science then moves on to be aware of what it is, then there'll be a new set of challenges, and people will look at that and say, yeah, sure, tell me something interesting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Good. Glad you liked it.